Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. It's so greatly appreciated. Truly is. So we are at part three of our 3-part series, our story time. Parts 1 and 2 are linked in the description. Please go watch them first because otherwise you will have zero idea what I'm talking about and you will never be able to follow along with anything that I'm saying. This has taken me a really long time to do, like a really long time to do. So long that even my background has changed because Christmas is over. But I wanted to put everything into this. I wanted to bring you guys the best possible story time that I could. So I really hope that you are liking it. Okay, and with that, let's jump right in. After being released from jail, I had been hanging out at my apartment a lot, just trying to lay like as low as possible when I get a knock on the door. I open it, and who should I see standing on the other side? Carlos. Yep, my scumbag boyfriend, scumbag brother-in-law. Through the locked door, I told him I was really tired and that I would talk to him tomorrow. I turned to walk down the hall to my bedroom, and all of a sudden he busts through my apartment door. He grabs me and asks me if that's any way to treat my PIMP. I said, fuck you. You are not my PIMP. Now get off of me. He told me that I owed him $15,000 that was taken from him the night that he was arrested. Then he bites me on my shoulder and we start fighting. He pulled my hair, dragged me down to the floor. Finally, somehow, I was able to position myself just right that I could get my hand out, and I slapped him as hard as I could. So hard that my hand began to sting. I ran over to the other side of my bed and I grabbed a knife that I keep in my nightstand. He looked at me and he started to laugh, asking me what I thought I was going to do with that. Then he told me that he would be back with a gun to kill me. He turned around and he walked out of my apartment. I grabbed a bottle of vodka and I drank it till I passed out. The next day, I paged Tyrone 6 times before he finally answered me. When he did, I asked him to meet me at our local hangout, Hector's Bar. When I walked into the bar, I saw the Lincoln brother, Javon, sitting at the bar. I went over to him, I gave him a hug, and I told him how sorry I was to hear about Jamal. He told me that the doctors believed his brother died from a virus that he got because of sharing needles, and that the rest of the family had to quarantine for a while. I think, side note, what they're talking about, because remember this is the 80s, late 80s, I think that they're talking about HIV. I think. I don't know. And she doesn't specify. When Tyrone showed up, we went and sat at a table to talk privately. He told me that the bosses didn't want him talking to me. Rumor was that I was a rat and began to spin out of control. I told him if I was really a rat, then I wouldn't have spent the last 3 months behind bars. He promised me that he believed me, but let me know that there was nothing he could do about it. I told him about Carlos. I told him how he broke into my house, how he attacked me, how he was going to kill me. And then I begged him for protection. He said no. I told him that I thought he wanted to be with me. I asked him, where did your feelings go? He pulled me in really close and he whispered to me that if I'd left Armando to be with him when he asked, things right now would be different. reminding me that I had turned down his offer. He told me that he was sorry, but that he could no longer be seen with me. Then he got up and he left the bar. I was crushed. I walked over to the bar where Javon was sitting and I ordered a shot. Javon, who was clearly incredibly intoxicated at this point, began hugging me and apologizing to me. So, giggling a little, I told him that he was just drunk and that he had never wronged me because, as far as I knew, he hadn't. But he was very adamant that he was incredibly sorry and that he had something to tell me, and he wanted to tell me before he died. He looked at me and he said, "Do you remember the night that everything went down? The night you got arrested?" Duh, that's a stupid question. I say, "Of course I do." He tells me that he was paid by Armando to call him when I got there. Armando set me up to take the fall. I stood up, I walked outside, and I began to puke. I never confronted Armando about what I was told, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Like how I begged Armando to let me go out with him that night, and he refused to let me go with him. Carlos never did come back to my apartment, but he would call and harass me on a continuous basis. Then one day he told me that if I didn't go to his house to discuss our little problem, that he was going to show up at my apartment. So, scared and basically being left with no other choice, I agreed to go over there. When I got there, Carlos was sitting on the kitchen floor with a mirror, Coke, and a razor blade. He was wearing a red velvet sweatsuit, and it was the middle of July. Without saying a word, he pulled a gun from his pocket and he shot 3 times. All 3 bullets hit the wall right next to me. I asked him, "What the is wrong with you?" And he told me to shut the fuck up. I reached into my bag, the bag that was on my shoulder, to reach for my keys. And it was at that moment that I realized that all 3 shots had traveled through my purse before hitting the wall. I screamed at him, "You could have killed me." To which he replies, "If I wanted to kill you, I would have." Then he told me that I was going to be his girlfriend, that I was going to turn tricks for him, and that I was going to give him the money, telling me that he was going to be a real PIMP now. I told him no fucking way. I started crying, knelt down on the ground, and told him to kill me right now. I would rather be dead than do that for you. He laughed at me and told me that he wasn't going to kill me because this was way too much fun. Then he told me that if I tell people that he's my boyfriend, that I will not only get protection, but that I will be allowed to pay him back slowly. I got up, I walked out, and I left shaking. I thought for sure that I was a goner. And one night as I was walking into the bar, Sergeant Conroy, the sergeant that had me in his office at the station, passed me in his car and stops. He told me that he patrols this area from time to time, but that he had come down here specifically looking for me. With another officer in the car with him, he asked me to go out to dinner with him one night. I go, "Sure." Wrote down my number and headed into the bar. September 1986, my lawyer's office calls and asks me to come in to speak. They bring me into a room and I wait. Then a man by the name of Joseph Sims walks in, introduces himself to me, and tells me that he's David's partner and that David has handed the case over to him. He told me to make sure not to speak to anyone about anything, telling me that he was my lawyer and that he was basically the only person that I should trust. So I told him, don't worry, because I don't trust anyone anyway. And I truly didn't. Then he told me that I needed to get a job, a real job, and fast. He said he didn't care if I went to flip burgers, just as long as I had a real job. He also told me that I was going to plead guilty to everything, telling me that if I pled guilty, I would only be looking at 3 years or even probation. If I pled not guilty and lost, I could be looking at 25 years behind bars. He also told me that my friends were not my friends and that I needed to stay away from them. I left his office with my head all over the place. But the first thing that I did was to call my father and ask him to get me a job. My father had finally pulled through on something for me. And before I knew it, I was getting up at 5 a.m. to go to work Monday through Friday to sift through dirt at a construction company. And my first paycheck was a joke. It was a joke. I was making the same amount of money for 40 hours work that Armando would pay a limo driver to take us around for the night. The only plus that came out of my new real member of society life had been that it had given me a few extra new customers. But despite my crappy paychecks, I was still partying at the lounge every night. Then in late September, the doorman Connor came over to me and told me that Carlos was outside in the parking lot and that he wanted to speak to me. I told him no, but he assured me that he would stay with me out there. Carlos was out there in his white silk pajamas, and before I could even plead my case, he hit me so hard that my mouth began to bleed. Then he walked over to his car and came back waving a gun. Connor and the bouncers that were supposed to have my back ran like little bitches. I begged them not to leave me, but they told me that I would be fine. He only wanted to talk, and then they turned around and they went back inside. He threw me to the ground and he pointed a 9mm at my face. He started yelling at me for partying there every single night and only giving him $2,000 so far. He told me he wasn't going to kill me here because there were too many witnesses. He was going to wait and come to my apartment to do it. Shortly after the night at the lounge, I decided that unless I wanted to be pushing up daisies, I better find a new place to live. October 1986, I rented a small house in a quiet part of town behind another house and completely hidden from the street. I just had to make it to November 25th, my sentencing date. I couldn't plan out my future until I knew what the court's decision for me was going to be. The next morning, my friend Nikki is banging at my door. She walks in and she shows me a newspaper. And on the cover, it says that Carlos had killed a man last night around the corner from my new house. He didn't even know the guy. He just picked a guy at random and he shot him 3 times and then he took off. Something deep inside of me tells me that those bullets were meant for me. Carlos may have gotten away with it, except for the fact that he was less than smart and he decided to go over to the hospital to check on his victim. While he's there, police question him and they end up finding the weapon on him. Nikki hugged me so tightly and told me that my worries were over, that he couldn't get me now, but I still didn't trust it. Something inside of me told me, like, even though he did this and he went to the hospital because he's an idiot and he had it on him and he got caught, I'll get blamed for it somehow. And I was right not to trust it, because right after his arrest, my phone began ringing and it was Carlos. He told me that he didn't care if it took him 20 years to kill me. He was going to kill me. He called me at least 12 more times after this, and his messages were always the same. Normally, I would let my answering machine pick up the calls, but one time I picked up and I tried to reason with him. I asked him why he would want me dead if I never did anything to him. And he told me that because I opened up my mouth to Armando about us, that he has now lost everything and that I would have to pay for it. And he doesn't care how long it takes. At his court date, Carlos pled guilty and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. After the sentencing, I decided to leave my fancy apartment and rent a small, dilapidated house with stained carpets and wallpaper that was falling off. I scaled down my selling significantly and started hiding my drugs in a real-looking Coke can whose top unscrewed. I told myself that this was a genius idea, believing that if I ever got raided again and they found it, they could never prove that it was mine, especially since I kept it outside. One night, I had a bunch of my friends over. They had done a bunch of lines that I sold them. Then they start talking about the men hiding in the trees behind my house. Then my friend Jeff chimes in on the conversation and says that he saw them as well. I went outside. Granted, it was dark out, but I looked around and I didn't see a thing. It was then that I convinced myself that the coke had gotten to their heads. I chuckled to myself and went back inside. Right before my parole hearing in mid-November, my lawyer calls me into his office. He asked me if I had a drug problem. I told him not really, but it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that I'm an alcoholic. He told me that that was good, not for my health, but for my case. He told me to take the approach that I had a drinking problem. Then he asked me about my family, and I told him that my entire family was alcoholics. Again, he told me this would be great for my case. When I told him the story about how my parents abandoned me and my sister when I was 15, he told me to make sure that I included that in my interview as well. My parole hearing was 2 weeks before my sentencing. The interview was with a woman named Susan, and it lasted about 3 hours. I told her about my parents and about how I had dreams of going to school to be a writer. When she asked me if I liked to read, I said, of course I do, and I pulled out a copy of The Scarlet Letter that I had in my bag. Then she asked me when I started drinking. I told her 12. She asked me where my mother was at this time, and I told her that she was cheating on her second husband. She asked me how often I drank, and I told her every day. She asked me if I wanted to stop, and I told her that I did, but that it was the only thing that numbed the pain of being alive. I left that meeting feeling good. The night before sentencing, I couldn't sleep at all. That morning I got up, showered, put on a classy black business suit like my lawyer told me to, and drove over to the courthouse. When I walked in, I saw my father Zach and his wife Lorraine, my mother Joan, and my sister Celie. A couple of my friends and my lawyer were in attendance, of course. Mateo, Janet, and I were all being sentenced consecutively. The judge called Mateo first. He told him that he was charged with a Class C felony of possession, a Class C felony of intent to distribute, a Class E felony of drug packaging equipment, and a Class A misdemeanor of possession of paraphernalia. Mateo pled guilty to all of the charges and was sentenced to no less than 3 years in prison and no more than 10 years in prison. Janet was next. She was charged with the same 4 felonies. She pled guilty to all of them, and she was sentenced to the same exact thing as Mateo. I was up next, and I pretty much knew what my sentencing was going to be. The only thing that I had going for me that Janet and Mateo didn't was that I had a lawyer and I had a job. Right before my name was called, my lawyer, who walked in with the probation officer that interviewed me, asked to approach the bench. He sits down, and then my name is called, and I step forward. He read out the same charges as Mateo and Janet, and he asked me how I pled. I told him that I pled guilty to all of them. Then he told me that my probation officer, Susan, asked the courts to consider probation for me in lieu of jail time. He asked me if I was working, to which I replied that yes, I was working. He asked me where I worked, and I told him that I worked in a construction lab. He asked me what I did there, and I told him that I sift the dirt out of the rocks. He asked me why I did that, and I told him that it was to determine the quality of the soil at the construction site. He asked me why that would be such a job, and I told him it's needed to know the type of concrete that would have to be used for the foundation. He ends his questioning by telling me that he wanted to see what my answers to these questions were going to be, going on to explain that anyone could have anyone sign a piece of paper on my behalf saying that I worked for them. Which is pretty genius, right? That's kind of smart. In the end, the judge decided to sentence me to time served plus 5 years probation, stressing to me that if he saw me in his courtroom again for any reason, big or small, that he was going to make me serve the full 10 years. He asked me if I understood what was expected of me, then told me I was free to leave. There were tears of joy and screams that filled the courtroom. Celie, my father, my mother, my friends, and my lawyer all congratulated me. I didn't see Lorraine in the courtroom at this point, but I didn't think too much about it, nor did I really care where she was, if I'm being honest. We grabbed our stuff and got out of that courtroom as quickly as possible before he changed his mind. As we were walking to our cars, my lawyer calls out to me. I turn around and I ask him if he wants to come to lunch with us, but he asks me to come to my probation officer's office with him, that she has something to ask me. I say, sure, no problem, and I tell my family that I'll be right back. I walk into Susan's office, and I finally find out where Lorraine has been this whole time. Susan asks me to take a seat, and then she drops the bomb on me. She tells me that my stepmother has asked her to revoke my parole because she says that I'm still selling. I started screaming at her, calling her a liar, a drunk, and a see you next Tuesday. She told me that she was just worried about me because she loves me. Then I told my lawyer to go get my father to clear this whole thing up. My father walks in the room and he stands behind me and he puts his arms on my shoulder. It takes him a few minutes to really comprehend what is going on, but when he does, he is furious. He tells my probation officer that I work hard every single day at his company and that he visits me at my apartment every single week. He follows this up by telling Susan that his wife has a real problem with lying and drinking. My officer asks everyone to please leave the room except for me. After everyone is gone, she leans over her desk, grabs my hand, and says, "So that's them, huh?" She says, "I just want you to know that your stepmother only strengthens my belief that you deserve a second chance at life. I will never believe her again, I promise." And with that, I get up and I leave. At night, Celie and a few of my friends come over to hang out and drink. Celie gets so drunk that night that she starts throwing up all over herself. I had to end up calling her boyfriend to come and get her. I put my baby sister in the car, told her that I loved her, and sent her off, not knowing that this would be the last time that I would ever party with her again. December 1986. I was sitting in my apartment watching TV when my phone began to ring. When I answered, the woman on the other end introduced herself as Debbie, a nurse at Brookfield Hospital. She tells me that Celie has been in an accident and that I need to get to the hospital immediately. I asked her if she was still alive, and she told me yes, but that I need to get to the hospital now and to tell her how to get in touch with my parents. I told her that I would inform my parents and be right there. I called Zach and Joan, and I was crying so bad that they could barely make out what I was saying. Then I jumped in my car and I did 90 all the way to the hospital. I ran through the hospital doors screaming for Celie, demanding to see her. Then, out of nowhere, Armando appears looking distraught with a bloody scratch on his face. As soon as I saw him, I knew he was the person that was responsible for this whole thing. I screamed at him our whole relationship, that he drove too fast and now he may have killed my baby sister. I started screaming at him and punching him, and it took multiple security staff to get me off of him and calm me down. Suddenly, a doctor appears in the waiting room and he is not happy. He told me that he could hear me screaming profanities all the way in the operating room. He told me that this was a place for sick people and that he would not tolerate this type of behavior in his hospital. I told him who I was and that I wanted to know what was going on with my sister right now. He wouldn't talk to me at first because I wasn't her parent, but after I told him that both my parents were drunks and that I was the person raising Celie, he agreed to talk to me. He told me that Celie was paralyzed from the neck down, and if she did pull through, she would be living a very different life. While waiting for my parents to arrive, Armando came over to me again. He told me that it was all an accident. He was taking Celie and Bonnie to the mall, that he wasn't going fast, and that his car slid on the ice. I didn't believe that. Finally, my parents arrived at the hospital. We all sat in the waiting room and sobbed for hours. Eventually, the doctor that yelled at me when I first arrived came back to talk to us. He told us that Celie was in the ICU and that she had a chance of pulling through. Then asked if we would like to see her. Of course. She was sleeping from the anesthesia and she had tubes coming out of everywhere. She was on a breathing machine because her lungs were popped in the accident. The tube that was coming out of her throat was hooked up to her breathing machine. She was being given food, water, and medicine through the tubes that were in her arm. She was also hooked up to a machine that was monitoring her heartbeats. The doctor couldn't promise us that she would live and suggested that we have people bring us some of our things, telling us that we shouldn't plan on leaving the hospital anytime soon, just in case. I asked the doctor, if she does live, will she ever walk again? And he said, I'm sorry, she will not. Later that night, a state trooper came to visit us in the hospital. He told us that the car was driving 85 miles per hour when it took a sharp turn and flipped 3 times. He said that nobody was wearing a seatbelt, and Armando and Bonnie were thrown from the car and barely suffered a scratch. Celie wasn't thrown from the car. She broke her neck when she hit the roof of the car and burst her lungs when she hit the dashboard, and she almost suffocated. Had it not been for the fact that a lung doctor was behind them at the time with a special machine in his car, Celie would most likely have died at the scene. He then went on to say that Armando and Bonnie were claiming that Celie was the person driving the car. I started screaming at him that this was a lie. Armando himself told me that he was the driver. He apologized to me multiple times in the hospital. I told him to talk to the staff or watch the cameras in the hospital to see what happened. Then I told them all about Armando and Bonnie. Bonnie was a sex worker who did drugs. Hardly someone that should be trusted. I know what you're thinking, but I was never a sex worker. The officer told us that when Celie woke up, he would get a statement from her. About 24 hours after the accident, a nurse came running into the waiting room to tell us that Celie was awake and wanted to see us all. We ran to her room as quickly as possible. She was sitting up in her bed, making a clucking sound with her tongue. I asked the nurse if she could talk, and she told me that it was very difficult for her to do so. When she saw me, she smiled. I ran over to her, I gave her a kiss, and I told her how much I loved her. My parents were there, they were crying, and Celie's boyfriend was there as well. She knew who we all were, and she was so happy to see us. My parents and I spent days at the hospital. We ate there, slept there, and showered there. Leona would randomly show up to the hospital drunk to start fights with my dad about how his other children needed him and how she needed to get them Christmas presents. After a few choice words from my father about how he has a dying child and he doesn't give a fuck about Christmas presents, Leona would turn around and leave. For days and days, Celie had multiple surgeries and she had to fight for her life. About 2 weeks later, the DEA Michael that busted at me showed up and asked me to go across the street with him to get a drink. We sat down and he asked me what I wanted. I told him that I wanted a vodka and he came back with a ginger ale. Then he sits down and he says, "You didn't think I was going to buy a kid vodka, did you?" Well, I did. Thanks for nothing, dude. He sat down and told me once again that he wanted Armando. As badly as I wanted to, I couldn't tell him what he wanted to know. He's a cop, and the rules in the streets are that you don't talk to cops. Michael got really serious for a moment and he looked at me. He reminded me that I was on parole and facing 10 years in jail if I screwed up just once. Then he told me that he knew I was still dealing and that my soda can full of Coke was no longer at my apartment. I asked him how he knew that. Like, he knew everything. He told me that him and his team were the people in the trees. Yep, my friends weren't crazy. They were actually spot fucking on. I asked him why he kept putting his neck on the line for me when he didn't even know me. He told me it was because I was a kid and he knew I was different and that I could do great things. Lastly, he begged me to get away from them and to go into hiding. Then he walked me back to the hospital and he left. Even though I was exhausted from the stress I was going through and from crying myself to sleep every night, whenever I saw Celie, I always made sure to put a smile on my face. 15 days after the accident, the doctor told me to go home and get a good night's sleep. Celie was doing much better, and he felt comfortable telling me to go home for the evening to get some real rest. Around 11 p.m., my phone rings. It's the doctor at the hospital. He asked me to come back to the hospital sometime tonight and soon. I didn't really understand this at first. I mean, he just sent me home. Why was he calling me back already? It didn't make any sense to me. If I'm being honest, I dragged my feet a little bit getting there. I even stopped in the lounge for a few drinks before arriving at the hospital a little after 1 in the morning. In my defense, I had just been told to go home for the night. I thought she was fine. When I got to the ICU, 2 of the night nurses that had gotten to know me stepped out from behind their stations. I told them that I was here to see my sister, and they both stared at me with these bizarre looks on their face. They wouldn't allow me inside of Celie's room, and they told me to go to the other room to speak to my family because they were in there waiting for me. That's when it clicked. My baby sister was dead, and it was all my fault. I ran towards my family as fast as I could. My parents, step-parents, and Celie's boyfriend began to walk towards me. And as soon as I saw him, I just collapsed. My dad picked me up and brought me over to the couch where I just completely broke down. My 16-year-old baby sister who had just spent the last 16 days fighting for her life, was gone forever. A little while later, I told my father that I was ready to see her. He gets up and then he comes back and he tells me that she had already been taken down to the morgue. So I take a deep breath, I step into the elevator, and I head down to the morgue. The entire ride down, I could feel Joan giving me the death stare, and it made me feel so incredibly uncomfortable. Then the day of Celie's wake comes. Armando sent a huge wreath that my father had removed from the funeral home. He also showed up to the wake, and when my father saw him, he ran to the door and chased him out of the funeral home. After the wake was all said and done, my parents sued Armando for wrongful death. But Armando got Bonnie to agree to testify under oath that Celie was the person who was driving, and because the only two people still alive were telling the same story, the court decided to believe them. Then, to add insult to injury, the court also threw out my parents' wrongful death suit. The only compensation that they received from losing their baby to this scumbag was $50,000 from his insurance company. And they did decide to give me $10,000 from it to help me out. Armando came to my house after he used Bonnie to lie for him and begged me to forgive him. I screamed at him. I called him a liar. He apologized to me again for what he had done, but I didn't care. I was done hearing his sorry excuses. I showed him to the door, and then I saw that he was driving a brand new IROC to replace the one that killed my sister. I slammed the door, and I never spoke to him again. All right, guys, if you're still here, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you, and I appreciate you so, so, so very much. There is so much more to this story that I didn't include. So if you want, this is the book. Please go buy the book, support the author, and then come back and let me know what your thoughts were on the book. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. One last side note. The author left at the very end of the book that she was shocked to find out that a few months after everything went down, the DEA caught Armando selling 20 pounds of coke a week. Yeah, the one that wanted him so badly. Well, he became a prized informant for the DEA and was described as cooperating substantially. Going on to say that Armando was helping him apprehend the major drug traffickers. Well, isn't that some shit? And in total, Armando only spent one night in jail. One. And with that, I love, love, love you guys. Until next time, stay safe out there.